Good UX is almost invisible, but bad UX can make a game literally unplayable. Let's talk about that. Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here. UX is something very near and dear to my heart. It is a part of what I do every day for my job. And I think far too often indie game devs forget about UX or may not even understand what UX is, because it's not something you can cover in a very basic tutorial, or at least not in the same way you can cover key bindings. So let's actually talk about what UX is and why it's so important. Accessibility is the idea that there are players who have different abilities, and those players want to be able to play your games. But for many players, they can't play games if they are set up incorrectly, whether it's through actual physical manipulation of the controls or through the UI itself. How can we fix this? Well, UX is one of the most important tools in our tool bag as indie developers. UX kind of covers a broad spectrum of user experience, is what it's known as. And with that, there's a lot of different things that you can do for users to make it so that they have a better UX experience. And so with that, we're going to kind of cover some basic fundamentals. But a big thing to understand is that UX is more than just, a lot of people talk about, UI design when it comes to UX, and that's definitely very important. But there's a lot of different components that play into this. You have things like key binding systems. Those are extremely important when it comes to UX, because if a player has a disability that prevents them from, say, using their left hand, with key binding systems, they can actually remap the keys to something that suits their needs. And that is without the developer's input at all beyond the base key binding system. Now, some games have gone so far as to actually include settings and defaults for players with certain disabilities, which I think is a great step. But even if you only just include a simple key binding system, your normal players are going to appreciate you, but your players with disability will actually be able to play your game, versus before they may have been stuck, unable to play, or if they were playing, they were having a very difficult time. So I think that example right there really encapsulates why UX is so important. Let's talk about a little bit of the actual UI side now. When it comes to UI, there's a lot of different disabilities. You have visual acuity issues, you have color blindness issues, and you have what's known as visual impairment. So what are these things? Any kind of visual impairment is, for example, if you're someone with glasses, if you take them off, everything gets really blurry. There are people who are unable for one reason or another to see screens in that same way, whether it's because while wearing glasses it's painful for them, for others it gives them headaches. There's a large variety of reasons. And so with that, something you want to take into account maybe is, what does this look like for somebody with visual acuity issues? Now, you can't account for every single scenario, but the goal is to make your design more inclusive off the rip, because then you get more of a connectedness with your players, both those with disability and those without. Because the biggest thing people get confused is they think that accessibility only applies to players with disabilities. But in actuality, there are plenty of players who are perfectly able who just get more of a benefit from having these UX changes. A great example I can give you is there's a lot of AAA games that don't have some sort of colorblind settings or colorblind awareness. And so what ends up happening is, let me actually share my screen here. You get issues where players with color blindness can't actually make out certain details and certain elements. So let's go ahead and look here. We've got two little toad symbols here. These are used for colorblind testing because players who have normal eyesight will see this guy on the right, but players with red-green color blindness may see that look more like this on the left. Now, at a glance, when you're down here and kind of zoomed in, it looks, you could make out what's here. It's not too big a deal. But something people don't think about is the further you get away, or the smaller that icon gets, the harder and harder it is to see the actual details of those little diagrams. And now this is kind of an example using color blindness testing, but that sort of methodology, that mindset, can be applied to any number of situations. When you have players who don't actually have difficulty seeing things, it can be hard as a developer to know when to make something different, when to change or tweak a design to actually make it usable for people with disabilities or just for standard players who may not have ever picked up your game. So as an example here, when you've got a lot of things a player can do, you can kind of get information overload. They don't know where to start, they don't know where to begin, they don't know what's going on. And so the best thing to do is to include prompts. Now, you don't have to handhold your players. You can make things a little bit more stripped back. But especially in games with, indie games, we're not necessarily going to have all the tools at our disposal to give them the most well-rounded tutorial we could ever give them. So you can do things like having an input mapping screenshot that shows them like the base setup. You can have things like, for example, if there's something a player could do, an action that is critical, let's say their ship is overheating and they need to be able to know that because it can impact either their ship's stats or it could actually destroy them. You want to have something that, warns them, it tells them, but not just warns them that like the ship's overheating. You want to give them information on how to fix it. So for example, your ship's overheating, vent it to reduce heat. That's a really great example. It's simple. It still doesn't force the player to do anything or handhold them through it. It just gives them the information. It gives them an option they can take. And then on top of that, you've got things, for example, let's say you've got a system where you're designing a gun with attachments. And a lot of games will have, for example, Call of Duty has a limited number of slots. And so you'll have it once you've locked in your slots, you can't change the other things. They're actually grayed out. Those buttons are grayed out, so you can't actually do anything. That tells the player very quickly, very visually, hey, this is the most you can do. As well as in Modern Warfare, they had the buttons, and those buttons would highlight for every attachment you add. So at a very, very fast glance, a player could see, oh, I've got 4 attachments. Oh, I've got 2 attachments. And it makes it very simple for the player to actually see what's going on and really be engaged in the game. Now, one question you might ask yourself, well, if I'm not red-green colorblind, how do I test for this? Well, there's 2 types of tests when it comes to actually like getting down to the nitty-gritty of telling what your players are going to experience. You have contrast testing, and then you have color blindness testing. Now, there are a few others. These are the 2 I would say are the most important. And so with that, contrast testing basically says if you've got 2 elements, what is the difference between those elements? How clear is that line drawn? So for example, here I've got 2 different contrast tests I ran on my main UI here. And with that, I ran this text against this dark background and this lighter background here. And as you can see, they both passed the contrast testing. So there's something called the WCAG. They basically set a lot of the standards for accessibility on the web. It's really handy for game development too, because you want to meet a lot of those same accessibility standards. And so with that, I checked these and these met the contrast ratio. Now the contrast ratio, I believe the actual minimum you should reach is about 2. Now technically if you're under that, you can still use those colors together, but you need to increase the size of the text. So for example, if you have text at size 12 font and text at size 24 font, even if they have the same contrast ratio, the size of the bigger font is going to be a little bit easier to read than the text at the smaller font. And the reason for this is our eyes are built to pick up bigger things, larger objects, larger, size things. And while, aesthetically you don't want to maybe have giant, jitterbug style text everywhere, you can still kind of consider that when you're designing your text, because a title, you might be okay with going up a couple pixels because it's already bigger than everything else. But something like button text, you're like, oh, I don't want to actually make that big because I want these to look very sleek. And so with that, you're like, okay, maybe I'm going to tweak actually what color I'm using as my palette. And that's where we get into sort of palette choices. Palette choices are very difficult to nail down correct palettes because, there's a lot of options out there. There's palette generators. Something a lot of those palette generators do have, though, is the option to include color blindness. So what they do is they have a certain number of set colors that when they are next to each other, they affect people with color blindness more than other colors. And so what you can do is you can usually check that and that'll do that. Worst case scenario, if not, a lot of tools actually give you, or sorry, a lot of programs give you the tools to actually test that. So for example, here I'm in Figma, and if I wanted to test something, I can actually go up here and free plugins. There's a ton of free plugins. But it's here, I've got color contrast and accessibility simulator. So if I go ahead and open up this one actually lets me see the designs with different types of impairments. So for example, here I've got eye strain and light sensitivity. If I go ahead and simulate this, it kind of gives me an idea of what that player might see my screen looking like. Now this is just a simulation and everybody's different, so they may see it differently, but this is a rough idea of what they say that it should look like. Then we can move on to a slight visual acuity. You know, everything's a little bit blurry. And then you have severe. So this is where you start running into minimum size if you're wanting to make sure that you meet, you know, standards, accessibility standards for things like this. You can kind of worry about, you know, right here, it gives some recommendations too for compliance. You know, 13 to 15 pixel size minimum for main body content. All fonts have sufficient space for client side 150% zoom, because players will actually zoom in to try and see your text better. And then it gives you some notes about what your current file has. So see, I've got all these different size fonts, and it's just saying, hey, you got this many of this size. So that way, you know, if you got some that are smaller than the recommended size, you know that you need to go find those and fix those. You've got your protopania, which is your red-green color blindness. And as you can see here, it gives you a really great visual example because you can see all of your UI in that color. As you can see, because I designed my UI from the hop to be more contrasty, it's very easy for someone with red-green color blindness to see this. Now, the big concern comes in is not necessarily the contrast with color blindness, but the actual, you know, buttons and meanings. So if you notify a player with like a red flashing button, they might see the actual color changing flash, but they won't actually see what color you're changing it to. So warnings and actual like danger symbols look almost the same if they are using, you know, set colors and not using symbols. So that's an example. So let's say you have text that says, you know, your engine is overheating, and in your game that's really critical. That's like dangerous information. Instead of just, you know, coloring it, you can include things like warning symbols that like you can design to fit your universe. And it tells the players who are colorblind that not only is this danger, like, you know, oh, you know, it's something I got to worry about, it's critical that I worry about it because that symbol tells me that this is critical, versus just the text says, okay, I got to deal with this at some point. But yeah, and we got total color blindness as well. This is going to be straight black and white pretty much. And this kind of shows you, you know, players with color blindness. With total color blindness, it's much more important for the contrast. But as you can see here, you know, contrast is the most important part of a lot of these things because it allows players to better differentiate. But then on top of that, with color blindness, you worry about symbolism and how to best, you know, warn the player. And so a lot of indie game developers don't always, you know, worry about all these different things because, you know, they're focusing on making their game and releasing it, and that's important. But, you know, simple little changes like this can mean the difference for a player. There are players who may not be able to play your game if you don't include just little elements here and there like that, because they can't actually see the important information for them, or they can't, you know, using the keyboard and mouse, they can't access the important information for them. And so that's pretty much all I wanted to really talk about today. It's just sort of, you know, what type of UX testing you should do and things like that. If you have any more questions or want to ask anything about accessibility, definitely leave them in the comments below. I'm probably going to make some more videos on this in the future. I wanted to kind of lay this out here and detail it. But otherwise, I think that is it for today. So good luck, good hunting.